Development on Gradius III began in 1988, and it was planned to be Konami's biggest shoot-'em-up yet. Internally, the project was referred to as the final Gradius game, and was meant to be a summation of the entire series and its grand finale. Its development time took about a year to complete, which was more than double that of Gradius II's, and its lofty expectations would push its team to their utmost limits. The story sees Bacterian himself, the leader of the Bacterian Empire, attacking the planet Gradius, and the Vic Viper, as usual, being sent out to thwart the onslaught of enemies, and finally put an end to the series' lifelong antagonist. Up until now, all of the other enemies defeated in previous Gradius games had only been henchmen of Bacterian. The game's subtitle, From Legend to Myth, even offered a sense of reflection and finality. The stage was set for the story to finally reach its epic conclusion. Gradius III would continue to innovate on the power-up menu bar by not only offering many preset choices like its predecessor, but also introducing an edit mode that would allow players to mix and match various weapon types, though some weapons from the presets would not be available in this new mode. Additionally, there was an extra power-up slot on the menu bar represented by an exclamation point that gave players new choices, like the ability to speed down the Vic Viper or using a Mega Crush, found in-game as the blue capsules, which instantly eliminated all enemies on screen. Gradius III would be packed with 10 gorgeous and engaging stages, more than any in the previous games up to this point. These stages included many different themes and environments, from a space desert region and an expanse of bubbles to a fireball-filled mountain range and a botanical domain. The boss parade found in Gradius II would also make its triumphant return, with many familiar faces showing up to thwart the player's progress. A new pseudo-3D level was also added that utilized a third-person view behind the Vic Viper, where the ship would need to maneuver its way through many fast-moving obstacles similar to the high-speed stage in Gradius II. There would be no enemies present, but power-up capsules would appear throughout it and could be collected. 2 secret levels were also added that allowed you to play through the opening stages of either Salamander or the first Gradius game. To access these, you'd need to get hit by one of the 2 lower attacks from the final boss, Bacterian. As had become the standard, last bosses in each Gradius game were ridiculously weak and their attacks easy to dodge, so you'd have to know about the secret going into the battle unless you just had some really bad luck. During development, the team decided to crank up the difficulty for Gradius III to such an extreme that the title actually became notorious for it. The developers implemented a beginner mode which tones down the difficulty a bit, but once the player reaches the end of the 3rd stage, the game ends and tells them to try out the normal difficulty mode. In late 1989, Gradius III would launch exclusively in Japanese arcades and in parts of Asia, skipping both North American and European regions. The game was received well for its gorgeous graphics and tight gameplay, but some criticized it for its unfairly punishing difficulty. Gradius III would surprisingly only be ported to one platform shortly after its release, the Super Famicom/Super NES. This port would be considerably less difficult than the brutal arcade version and even added in some extra weapons and option formations in its edit mode. As per usual, some stages would be cut and others added into the Super NES adaptation. This version would also suffer from extreme amounts of slowdown when the screen became too crowded, though this would often help to make dealing with the countless enemies and bullets a bit easier. The arcade version would eventually be ported years later in Gradius collections for both the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation Portable, as well as being re-released decades later on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch in late 2020. The next 2 years would see the Gradius series finally make its way to Nintendo's popular handheld console. Nemesis released in 1990 for the Game Boy and surprisingly would share the same name across all of its versions in each region. It was a pretty standard Gradius game and would reuse many of the stages and enemies found in previous titles. A stage select would be available from the start, but Nemesis in its entirety would only end up being 5 levels long, making for a very short experience. The following year, in 1991, Nemesis 2 would also release on Nintendo's handheld, and just like its predecessor, it would contain only 5 stages. The North American version would end up using the Gradius name and be titled Gradius: The Interstellar Assault. While it wasn't completely devoid of staples found throughout the series, it did lack many, including the Moai statues and a classic Gradius stage. Neither of these games were considered mainline entries and are often viewed as just quick spin-offs. After these two Game Boy titles, the Gradius series would go quiet for quite a few years, and many started to wonder if Gradius III was actually going to be the last mainline game in the series. 5 years after the portable Nemesis 2, Gradius fans could finally rejoice as Salamander 2 would make its way into Japanese arcades. There had been a few spin-off titles in this time period, but nothing from the main series. Salamander 2, while not technically a brand new Gradius title, was still a reassurance to its fans that Konami had not forgotten them. This new title would utilize both 2D sprite graphics with some 3D elements mixed in. Just like the original Salamander, its direct sequel ditched the power-up menu bar in favor of a more simplistic weapon pickup system, though the team developing the game would make a few small changes to it for this title. Players could now also pick up option seeds that would constantly circle around their ship. When 2 option seeds were acquired, they would become a normal option found in the previous games. Options could now also be sacrificed in order to gain use of a short-term homing laser. Another change to the weapon system would be the ability to gain additional temporary upgrades to your normal weapons, like double shot and laser, when collecting the same weapon power-up again. The Big Viper would return as the first player's ship, but a new one would be added for the second player. Instead of the original Salamander's Lord British, it would be replaced with a brand new Super Cobra ship, most likely a reference to Konami's 1981 spiritual sequel to Scramble. Salamander 2, just like its first title, would contain 6 different stages, with a few of its original bosses even making cameo appearances. The game would hit arcades in 1996 to a somewhat lukewarm reception. Fans and critics were happy to have the series back, but many agreed that it brought very few new ideas to the table and lacked the quality in its design found in the first game. Salamander 2 would be ported to consoles the following year as part of the Japanese exclusive Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, alongside the original Salamander and the Japanese version of Life Force. A decade later, it would also see a release on the PlayStation Portable in Salamander Portable, a collection of the Salamander games and a few other Konami shoot-'em-up titles. To this day, Salamander 2 has never officially made its way outside of Japan. People wouldn't have to wait much longer for a new Gradius title, as Konami was already preparing something new for longtime fans of the series. This new entry would not be found in arcades though, but instead on home consoles. When development began on this new entry in the Gradius series, it was decided early on that it would be a console game and developed exclusively for Sony's PlayStation. Planning on the title began in 1996, after Salamander 2 and the Gradius Deluxe Pack collection had already been released in Japan. Initially, the team working on this new project had considered making it a mainline Gradius game, but later chose instead to create a spin-off title in the same vein as the Salamander series, to give themselves more freedom in their design ideas. Konami had shown to be very strict with what its established mainline series could and couldn't do, which had just recently shown to work as a detriment in Salamander 2's creation. The team emphasized its separation from the mainline games by titling the game Gradius Gaiden. Gaiden is a Japanese word that literally translates into side story. This side story still resides in the Gradius universe, just like Salamander, but it takes place in the very distant future, far off from the events of the main series games. There would be 4 selectable ships available, each with their own unique set of weapons. The Big Viper and Lord British would return from the earlier titles, and newly added were the Jade Knight and Falcon Beta. Both new ships had very interesting weapons and offered some fresh and unique types of gameplay. The Jade Knight could emit circular pulses from its center, and the Falcon Beta would leave behind small black hole-like explosions where its shots collided that stayed active a few seconds, doing damage over time. Similar to Salamander 2, weapons could be powered up a second time by selecting them again on the power-up bar, although in Gradius Gaiden, these upgrades would be permanent instead of temporary. Also introduced was the ability to rearrange your power-up menu bar when first starting the game up, which allowed players to truly customize their experience. Gradius Gaiden would be broken up into 9 separate stages. Many of the usual Gradius suspects would be found in the game, like a boss parade, a high speed level, the murderous Moai statues, and a reimagining of the first game's classic volcano stage. This volcano stage would now slowly be getting pulled apart into a giant black hole though, which changed things up quite a bit. There would also be some other unique types of locales, like a snowy area and a ship graveyard. Not only could just one player go through these stages, but just like in Salamander, 2 people could play through them simultaneously. When the game finally hit the PlayStation in the summer of 1997, it was met with very positive impressions and reviews. Critics praised its graphics and soundtrack as well as its innovations on the previous Gradius titles. Some even went as far as comparing its fresh take on the series to another Konami side story that had been released earlier that same year, Castlevania: Symphony of the Night. Gradius Gaiden did not see a release outside of Japan until 9 years later, when it came bundled in the Gradius collection for the PlayStation Portable. The next year, after nearly a decade-long wait, development on a new mainline Gradius title would finally commence. In 1998, a new team at Konami was assembled to begin work on what would eventually become Gradius IV. Many had assumed Gradius III would be the final mainline title, but Konami had decided otherwise. Around this time in Japan, music and rhythm games were gaining massive popularity in arcades, and had slowly started to overtake and push out many other genres, shoot-'em-up games like Gradius included. The development team had a big challenge ahead of them to make Gradius a success again in the arcade, especially with the previous mainline title having been released around a decade ago by this point. At first, the developers had considered changing the gameplay drastically to something more 3D oriented, especially since they were using polygon graphics to create this title, but they eventually decided to stick with the tried and true 2D style. They would use Gradius II, Gopher no Yabo, as the game they would reference and build upon when creating this new entry. The project's director, Hiroyuki Ashida, had worked on Gradius II as a new hire and had a great fondness towards it as it was his favorite title in the franchise. Gradius IV would be given the subtitle Fukatsu, which is a Japanese word meaning revival. This was not only meant to represent the mainline series' return after being dormant for many years, but also a resurrection of the more classic type of arcade shoot-'em-up games seen as bullet hell titles had begun to overtake the genre. Finally, it would also represent the return of Gopher from Gradius II, who would be revived and make his comeback as the entry's main antagonist. This fourth game would remove the edit mode that Gradius III had pioneered, and instead offered 6 different preset weapon loadouts, 4 of which came directly from Gradius II, along with a choice of either a shield or force field. This was done to make it easier to keep its power-ups and upgrades more balanced. There would be 9 separate stages, although almost all of them felt like they were simply taken from the older games and retooled a bit. It did have some interesting ideas though, like plunging its volcano stage level completely into Magma halfway through and combining the crystal and bubble stages from Gradius II and Gradius III into one level. The majority of the Gradius staples would return as to be expected, but seeing them now rendered in 3D polygonal graphics was a new and interesting change for the series. The title screen would also finally put an end to the debate of how Gradius was officially supposed to be pronounced. Gradius IV would hit arcades in early 1999 to mostly positive reception, although similar to Salamander II, the lack of innovation and new ideas were pretty apparent. The title would receive a port to the PlayStation 2 the following year, being bundled alongside the previous Gradius mainline arcade title in a collection simply called Gradius III and IV, and also would see release once more 6 years later in the PlayStation Portable's 2006 Gradius collection. Gradius IV would be the final game in the series to ever see an arcade release, marking the end of an era. The next Gradius game would once again see the series returning to a Nintendo handheld.